Hi, this is the Bible Touchstone, and I'm responding to a video from Preterist Heresy, and I wanted to hold him accountable because I think he's poisoning the well of discourse. Not that I think that he's open to any kind of discussion with full preterists, seeming that he characterizes them using ad hominem attacks, and a lot of his arguments are appeals to spite, appeals to emotion, appeals to tradition, and not appeals to Scripture. But here's a case in this video that I'm responding to where he actually does appeal to Scripture. So I think it's warranted, especially since he appeals to 2 Timothy 2, where in verse 15 it says, "Study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth." I think it's right that we analyze his claims and see if his propositions or his conclusions are actually contingent and inferred from the appeals to Scripture that he's making. So in verse 16 it says, "But shun profane and vain babblings, for they will increase unto more ungodliness. And their word will eat as doth a canker, of whom is Hymenaeus and Philetus, who concerning the truth have erred, saying that the resurrection is past already, and overthrow the faith of some. Nevertheless, the foundation of God standeth sure, having this seal, the Lord knoweth whom are his, and let every one that nameth the name of Christ depart from iniquity." So, first I just wanted to point out that according to Preterist heresy, um, it is true that certainly some, if not most, full preterists would say that in the year AD 70, the resurrection was past. Now, that certainly is true to in some sense, but I think it's fair to say that that's a mischaracterization of the resurrection. And certainly I wouldn't describe it that way. I wouldn't say in AD 70, this definitive year, the resurrection was absolutely ended or just finished off. Everything was said and done. Now, certainly the works are finished before the foundation of the world. Certainly, sin was effectively dealt with at the cross. Certainly, I was foreknown. Certainly, I was predestined to be conformed to the image of Christ and by His works and His grace. So certainly, I was chosen and elected and called. Um, but it wasn't until I was justified, when I first had faith, that I was saved. And it wasn't until after that that I was also justified and made sanctified, and in that I was made glorified. So there's definite ordo salutis here, and so I wouldn't describe it as um, past already, but certainly all was fulfilled in the first century. If you want to say AD 70, that's fine, but there's a lot of reliance on this AD 70 stuff, this extra biblical stuff, and this dialectic historical materialism stuff. I think some full prayers may use as a crutch, and I don't want to go that way. Now, from Preterist Heresy's claims, he's relating the full preterist view with the error of Hymenaeus and Philetus. He shows that there's a resemblance because, as he says, it was only 3 years after Paul wrote these things that the full preterist claim is when the resurrection did happen. So 3 years before, let's say AD 67. Okay, let's just say that it's likely that Paul wrote at that time, and Hymenaeus and Philetus were saying that the resurrection had already happened. Now, why was that an error? And certainly it was enough to overthrow the faith of some. But it was an error because they were claiming things that were contrary to uh, what was actually being fulfilled by Christ in the near future. Certainly, Paul thought that it was very soon, but he also thought it was future from that time. So this is very important because it helps us understand and make sense of the eminency passages of Christ's soon return, but knowing for certain from passages like these that it didn't have already happened. Though they were not under the law anymore, that didn't necessarily mean that the resurrection had absolutely happened. Though some were already reigning with Christ, it wasn't until after Christ came that the rest of the dead were risen into one body fully at the resurrection of the dead. Now, is preterist heresy's claim contingent with the appeal that he cites? Well, certainly it's a slippery slope argument, because from this passage we see that the resurrection hadn't happened yet. But does that mean, let's just say it was AD 69, okay, let's just say it was December AD 69, and it was just going to be, a month or a few months before Christ did return. Now, if Christ didn't come then at that time, and it would be an error to say so, does that necessarily infer that Christ could not have came in that year, that next year, if it was within that generation? Does that necessarily infer from preterist heresy's implication that Christ would have to take hundreds or thousands of years to return? No, it certainly doesn't, and it's a slippery slope argument, much like a lot of his claims, like hyper-preterism is heresy, and he doesn't use any scriptural appeals to back that up. He just simply says so. So it's an ad hominem attack. It's not any kind of logical proposition that is warranted by any scripture. He says not one passage in scripture proves full preterism. Now, do any one passage of scripture prove that Christ would have to take thousands of years to return, even after he said in one generation that those things would be fulfilled? No, certainly not, and I think preterist heresy is holding on to a double standard, playing devil's advocate. That's why I think he should be held accountable for poisoning the well of discourse. Grace be to you.